Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Bergstein. I'm the ideas editor at the Boston Globe, coming to you from a still depopulated opinion desk of the Globe. And very happy to have the opportunity to talk with our panelists today to talk about the future of work. Lots to get to. Before we get into it, I'm going to let our sponsor at Northeastern University give us some opening remarks. Let me introduce Martin Diaz, who is a professor at Northeastern's DeMore McKim School of Business and the faculty director of the full-time MBA program.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Boston Globe, for holding this important conversation. As Brian mentioned, I'm a professor at Northeastern's DeMore McKim School of Business and the faculty director of the full-time MBA program, where experiential education and an entrepreneurial mindset is in our DNA. Our mission is to prepare leaders for the future of work in a world being shaped by digital convergence. That's people, process, and technology, cyber physical systems, hyper competition fueled by hyper connectivity. We are also fully committed to enabling leaders to foster inclusive cultures in the hopes of producing inclusive prosperity. There will be winners and losers in the future of work. Those employees that are prepared to leverage the short-term and long-term shifts in the employee-employer power dynamic will swim in the deep end of the pool of opportunity. Thanks, Chewy. According to the US Labor Department this April, 4 million people quit their jobs looking for greater opportunity. According to Indeed's Hiring Lab report this month, their US job postings on Indeed.com as of June 4 were 28.6% above February 2020. That said, postings for work that can't be done from home particularly recovered first and strongest. And employers need to better understand the disconnect between workers and senior leadership. Recent work trends research from Microsoft found that while business leaders said they're thriving, younger workers say they're just surviving or even struggling. Unhappy workers are less productive, and business leaders need to understand the link between employee satisfaction and corporate profitability. Thanks, Rebecca. Will pandemic era changes give workers more flexibility and more power? Today, we'll hear the panelists go beyond simple yes or no responses. Success is challenging and complex. In the Noam McKim School of Business full-time MBA program, we aim to develop leaders who cultivate individual and organizational resilience, bouncing back from adversity better than they were before. Leaders who shape company cultures where professionals can thrive as their authentic selves. Professional workers who are equipped with the technical, data, and human skills that humanics trifecta to push their organizations to new heights. Our full-time MBA program will help you go further to go farther, or if you prefer, go farther to go further. I'll explain how briefly at the closure of today's discussion. Today's panelists are insightful, passionate, and thought-provoking. I'm very much looking forward to learning alongside attendees as we collectively think through the challenges of bouncing back from COVID-19 adversity better than we were before as employees and employers. Back to you, Brian.
Okay, thanks, Martin, very much. So we're going to get started in just a little bit. I'm going to introduce our panelists. And then I just want to let everybody know who's watching that you can, if you have a question during this conversation, use the Q&A function. And thanks as well to the viewers who submitted questions in advance. So first I want to bring on Chewy Shaw, who is a site reliability engineer at Google. And he's coming to us where it's still morning his time, Mountain View, California. And Chewy is the vice chair of the new Alphabet Workers Union, which there's a lot for us to talk about there, but this was a union that was formed to represent a wide variety of voices in the company. And it got essentially off the ground this January. So we'll talk about that and how it fits into a whole bunch of other trends in work and workplace dynamics. So Chewy, thank you for being here.
Yeah,
Also,
thanks for having me.
And thanks as well to Rebecca Knight, who covers the changing workplace at Insider. Also, you may know it as Business Insider. Rebecca's a former editor at Harvard Business Review, and she produced several pieces for the recent Ideas special edition on the future of work, where we tried to get the answers to some of these questions. And, you know, we don't necessarily have all the answers, but we're going to try to talk through some of it. From talking to both of you, from seeing the questions we've gotten from readers, from seeing the response we've gotten to the ideas coverage we've gotten about the future of work, hybrid work, this is a moment, it seems, where people are really confused about what's going to happen. So the pandemic just blew the doors open on telecommuting, remote work, whatever you want to call it. And now it seems like no one's really sure what to go back to. Do you have a sense about whether the pandemic will be this sort of moment that changes everything, or will things kind of likely tip back to the way they were, not only in terms of where we work, but the kinds of flexibility that workers expect, demand, and so on?
I will go ahead and start by saying I absolutely think that this is an inflection point for the American workforce, for employers, for workers themselves. I think that the pandemic, we've all been traumatized for the past 15 months. Many people have lost loved ones, people have lost livelihoods. Even if you have emerged from quarantine relatively unscathed, you've still spent 15 months at home and feeling scared. So I think that, of course, that's going to change how we feel about our lives, our careers, the place that we want our jobs to fill in our lives. And I think that people are rethinking a lot of these things. And I think that that gets back to what Martin was talking about, those very compelling statistics about how people are quitting their jobs, people are planning to quit their jobs, and employers are having a hard time finding people. So I think that yes, absolutely, this is an inflection point. And I think that it would also be really sad if we went back to the way things were in 2019 without actually looking at the way that things were done differently, and saying, hey, maybe that actually worked better. And maybe people could feel more satisfied, more productive if they worked different ways.
Yeah, I think also in considering this, there's also just kind of the timing that we're at within the kind of this launch of the digital era. And so to an extent, there are certain elements of just how we got through this pandemic that were not possible any decade before this one. And there are a lot of ways where, employers have been able to just like tell people there's nothing better that we can do because this is just the status quo. I think there's a big element where what the pandemic did is it forced us to see how far can we go, how much can we do to make it work in unusual situation that employers have been telling us forever will never work out well, which has then caused a lot of people to rethink and reflect on just like what is it that they actually need, and to reject certain previous ideas around what is and isn't possible in terms of how their lives could be structured.
I mean, one of those things that people probably didn't think was possible would be that there'd be a union at Google.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about the Alphabet Workers Union, and also, do you think it might have formed if not for the pandemic?
Yeah. So first, I think the best way to really think about what led to the beginning of this union is really thinking about just like how much Google from its start was a company that really focused on its values being what it pushed forward as how the world got to know it. There are some companies that really focus on a person, that is the persona that you get connected to, some that really hone in on a specific feature. Google from the beginning has been focusing on a lot of different values, and that's been a large part of how they recruited a number of us to come and work for the company. And so to a large extent, we are kind of at a point where a lot of us feel like a few people making decisions at the top just structurally isn't working for a lot of the big problems that we're facing in society. And that we're starting to see just even in these really big companies with really intelligent leaders, that there are people who are just, their needs are being ignored, largely because it's just hard to process and deal with all of the different aspects of the complexity of all the people who, your products and your workplace is interacting with. And so it essentially was a space where a lot of us just kind of came to the point where we felt like the only way to move forward and really feel like we were able to keep up to the values that we came to live out at the company was to start taking more of a direct stance and really pushing for specific changes that we see necessary to make systemic improvements rather than just reactive improvements. And so I think like there's kind of a weird element in how the pandemic plays into all of this, because a lot of the stuff that really got workers at Google really interested in this started before the pandemic. It wasn't really the pandemic that was the big driving force for us, but it did highlight a lot of people's particular problematic situations, which then we've been able to really kind of focus on and help them with. And it's been a space where we're able to kind of show the value of the union in different ways by, this essentially being a time when, because of the extremes of what's going on in the world, a lot of people just end up on the short end of the stick where there's nobody looking out for their needs at all. And so it's been an opportunity for us to really be able to step in and try to help a few people who we've been seeing struggling, who in this situation, just like their needs were completely dropped. And so seeing what we can do to try to help turn that around rather than just kind of, sitting there on our hands. So I do think there's a certain element where the pandemic got a number of us to feel like we want to be doing something. And I think that then added a bunch of motivating energy to what we were doing. But I don't think the pandemic is what caused the organizing to work.
And it's not a typical union in the sense of there's no collective bargaining. You don't represent a sizable enough chunk of the workforce to do collective bargaining, but you can be a voice in other ways, right? And can you talk a little bit more about that? One thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so a large part of the way we ended up structuring ourselves had to do with the difficulties of considering how our workplace is structured compared to how the National Labor Relations Act, which passed almost 100 years ago now, and is still the primary basis for a lot of how we go through a lot of labor disputes. That model that it has for kind of thinking through how workplace organizing can work does not really take into account the idea of a multinational corporation with offices all across this country as well as other countries, where we are going back and forth between meeting with people in person and virtually, where the company has hundreds of thousands of people, and additionally hundreds of thousands of the employees, more than half of the employees, are considered to not be full-time employees but to be part of the contract workforce. And so with a lot of the complexities there, we saw just going for a direct vote around a contract, which is essentially kind of the typical process, didn't make sense. We saw that, for one, getting to the numbers of supermajority for one issue or one contract ended up seeming like it's the wrong strategy for us, when in general we want to support people speaking up about a lot of issues and be able to jump in wherever we can. And then two, the ways that we'd have to try to figure out how to fit in contract workers into this puzzle meant that if we were going to try to go directly for becoming a collective bargaining unit immediately, we would have to exclude a lot of people who are suffering. And so we decided that it would be better for us to, rather than rely on the full structure of the process of getting collective bargaining rights right now, to focus primarily on the protections we have as workers using collective action to make a difference, and to rely on the fact that when we do things as a union, then we are not just doing things as one rogue employee, but that it's a set of us who are trying to do things that we believe will make our company better. And so our goals do not exclude at some point getting some collective bargaining units down the line to then really push for different contracts throughout the firm. But our structure is not being focused on that being our only tool. We want to use every tool that we can, where having multiple people working on this together, being willing to put in their effort and being willing to think through these complex issues can get us further than where we are.
So Rebecca, what do you think when you hear about this? Because Google is often thought to be at the forefront of so many trends in work. It was thought to be the most enlightened employer for years because of how, they gave everybody free meals and massages and dry cleaning or whatever to keep them on campus. Now we're hearing that the workforce has grown so diffuse and there's a mixture of contractors that, as Chewy said, some people are struggling and don't necessarily have a voice that they feel they can, in a lot of ways that describes a lot of companies now, right?
Yeah, what has really struck me is when Chewy was talking the very beginning about the values that Google espoused, that so many customers were inspired by and so many employees wanted to go work for Google, and that was don't be evil. And you said this in your op-ed in the New York Times, Chewy, is that you sort of said, well, wait a minute, is Google not being evil now? Let's actually look at what the actions our leadership has taken and make sure that it is living up to the values that we came aboard for, that we wanted to be part of this mission. I think what's so interesting is just the contagion effect of unionization. I mean, this is happening in our industry, Brian. So many newsrooms and different slivers of news organizations are unionizing. There's a union effort at Insider where I work too. And I'm curious, Chewy, if are you sensing that there is going to be sort of a contagion effect in Silicon Valley too, among knowledge workers, saying we want to sort of galvanize here? What are you hearing from your colleagues at other companies?
Well, I mean, I think it goes even further than that, honestly, because I see right now that we're in the midst of a situation where throughout not just our country, but throughout much of the world, there's a lot of contending with what do these new global connectivities mean for how we relate? What does it mean for national identity? What does it mean for how governments control people's behavior, for how where people are expecting to get support in different ways? And so I think like with the way that a lot of things have changed, it's led to people asking the question of how do we change the ways our lives are structured? Can we get government to fix it? Can we get some really cool companies in the private industry to fix it? And there's a lot of ways that people are trying to look through these questions of just like, what are the next steps that we need to do to move our society forward? I see we're kind of in a point where labor organizing fits the specific needs of a lot of people right now, where we're seeing such a growing divide in how much people are able to make and what they actually need to support themselves, as well as a divide between how much the wealthiest among us are making and how much the poorest among us are making. And these divides are getting sharper and causing more and more very distressing and traumatic situations for a lot of people. And so what I see is there's a need for some space where change can be happening. I'm definitely seeing a lot of people within the tech industry seeing some of these questions of just like, can we trust that our executives are going to push us in a direction that's going to move things forward? There's also a lot of existential questions that are really gripping a lot of people in the industry. So how do we deal with climate change? Are our companies doing enough? Our companies have a lot of influence. Could we be doing more to make sure that our world survives? That's something that a number of people feel the need and have been for the past few years, starting to organize within the different companies to try to get workers together to try to see how do we push for these changes in a way that will actually, make a lasting difference rather than just one quick, great PR moment that sounds good. And so what I'm seeing is just like there's a bunch of different motivating forces that are getting people to want to have more control over how their companies are being operated.
Exactly how their companies are being operated, but then also how they are able to live their lives and do their jobs. And so I feel like there is this sense among so many different pockets of the labor force, this kind of twisted sister song, like we're not going to take it. We're going to stand up for rights. We want to do things differently. And I think the power is shifting and there is more, it's going in favor of the worker right now.
What do we make though of the fact that when workers want more flexibility. That's different for different people. So there was a really interesting story in Bloomberg that was on the bostonglobe.com site today that I read that just showed how complex this is. So for a lot of people, including many of the viewers who submitted questions in advance, more flexibility means they want more flexibility to work from home. There's a whole another slice of the workforce that, including a lot of younger workers, feels isolated. Maybe they don't have a good work from home setup, but whatever the reason, they're missing out on opportunities to learn from their coworkers, to show in these sort of in between work moments what they can do, be mentored and so on. So there's a lot of concerns for certain segments of the workforce about whether they'll be kind of forgotten or turned essentially into gig workers, which is actually a trend, like another cross-cutting trend in the economy. So how do we, on the one hand, say we're in this moment where workers are going to demand more flexibility, but for some workers they're going to say, I want to work from home as much as possible. Some people are going to say, I don't want to have to work from home. That's the definition of flexibility, is don't tell me where to work. It's a really tricky thing to manage, right?
It absolutely is. And that's why there really has to be so much intentionality about how and where and when work gets done. And also making sure that the people who are remote workers still have opportunities for advancement and are still visible within the organization. And so managers have to take some responsibility for that, of course, and make sure that they are not only giving opportunities to the people who are showing up in person, but the worker themselves have to take some agency here too, and think of ways to be creative, to make sure that they are developing relationships in the organization and broadening their networks and making sure that they are contributing in ways that are seen and noticed. But I also think that if you are someone who wants to work remotely, if you are someone who you're an introvert, or you do the kinds of work where you don't necessarily need to be collaborating, that also, I don't want to say it's career limiting, but I want to say that you're going to have a certain kind of career. It does not mean you won't be hugely successful as an individual contributor, but I don't think if you are a remote worker, you are going to be managing a team or being a real high profile leader in your organization. So I think that there are trade-offs, and many people are going to want to make these trade-offs because they want to have a life, not just make a living, but other people feel differently about their career. So that, you're right, Brian, that is sort of the ultimate definition of flexibility here.
Yeah, and then I think, Brian, you really brought up a key aspect of this, which is the complexity. And yes, you're right. It is complicated to try to figure out how do we properly add flexibility without, hurting productivity such that it hurts these companies' abilities to survive. However, I think we're also at a point where just because something's complex is not a good enough excuse to avoid it anymore. And that's part of why, for us, the solution that we see is we just need more people focusing on the different aspects of its complexity. Like, definitely, making a big change like this of changing how people operate long term in terms of how much time they're spending in the office, how much time they're working from home. It changes social dynamics. It changes dynamics of how people's expected work is done, how much people get checked in on. It changes a lot of different dynamics of how the day-to-day process works. But change isn't necessarily bad, and it isn't necessarily good. The important thing is to be able to analyze it and to be able to try to figure out what are the different things that you need to add in to properly balance out these different types of things. So it may be that, in some workplaces, what they find is that there are certain types of roles where you really need to have 1 week every month where everybody gets together and does certain things together. And then, after that, it doesn't really matter too much the rest of the month. They can do whatever. That may end up being what really gets them to gel well. It could be for some businesses, it's like there's one day each week that if everybody is on point together that day each week, then, the rest of the week they can be wherever they are, and that's fine. It could be that you really just need to structure your meetings in particular types of ways so that virtual attendees do feel welcome in just the right way. And once you make a welcoming, proper environment, then it actually works well for the remote attendees. And so there are definitely a number of dynamics where employers do really need to analyze what are the different ways that this is kind of impacting how these conversations are going, how the work is getting done. But I think that analysis then can lead to so many better ways, because like in general, we've been following one size fits all of sit at a desk for 8 hours a day and stare at your computer for a lot of these jobs. And so like sitting at a desk and staring at a computer, for me personally, it's not how I did work anytime before I got into this industry, but then like now that's what's expected of me. And so I had to change the way that I work when I joined the company to try to fit into this whole specifically have 8 hours each day that are my work hours, and then have specific unplug hours. And like everyone has different types of adjustments that they have to make. I think there are ways where we can allow for this process to really open the door for us to really tap into the productivity of how a number of people who this process has not been working for can then really become integrated into these work sites even better. So I think there's a bunch of opportunities that come out of this, of opening up a lot of people who the way that the expectations of society have been set up have been limited in the past as well.
I also just want to say the way you just described the way the work day is designed for sort of this old-fashioned way of working, showing up at a desk and moving papers around. But it's also the work day and work week is designed for sort of this Mad Men white male era where there was a wife at home who didn't work, who could take care of the children and take care of all the other aspects of life. And those things have changed. That's not the way it is anymore. So the idea that we would sort of go back to this old-fashioned way of, oh no, you have to go to a building to do your work, and this is the way that you have to show up at this time and you can leave at this time. It doesn't make sense anymore for the world we're living in.
One of the audience members asked a really interesting question of us, which is that if we could take as a given that employee morale is enhanced with the flexibility to work from home this much. But has anyone done any good analysis on how well it's actually working for the organization? So employee morale being, of course, an important metric, but it doesn't necessarily tell us whether it's working for the group and to allude to something you said, to really actually get the work done in a sustainable, meaningful way. What do we know? Or are we still too early to kind of not have much analysis of this?
I mean, I think there's always a weird mixture here, because like it's always been a element where employees being in a more stable, healthy mindset tend to be more productive. But, what specific actions get them to be in a healthy mindset and focused versus getting them into a space where they just unplug completely, do nothing in order to get healthier, And so like, it's kind of that distinction is kind of what I'm seeing, where like we're seeing some studies where if you look at a very particular company and analyze based off of how that company was producing beforehand and how it's producing now, then you can try to see that like the pandemic helped or hurt this particular company's productivity. But I think there are a lot of different interesting dynamics with each of these companies of just like before the pandemic, how much did they rely on using the fact that people were stressed in the office and using kind of parts of the setting of the office to keep them in a mindset that keeps them going, using stress, versus how much are they using enticement to get people to really enjoy the work that they're doing and move forward. And I think there's always been a lot of amount where every workplace has a little bit of both, and so like it's always been kind of a mixture, but like the different dynamics of how you balance out the fear elements versus the enticement elements. When we have a situation like this, if you're relying primarily on fear to get your employees working, that fear reduces when they're away from you. And so then their productivity is going to drop. But if you're using enticement, then that enticement doesn't really change if kind of they're still either it's like through connection to the projects or through the value of what they're getting for doing the work really makes it feel valuable to them, then they still feel compelled to still pour themselves into the work, even when they are taken away from that environment. So I think there's some different elements that are at play here, which make it very hard to say across the board, is this good or bad for productivity of the workplace? I think what it does is it changes the worker's relationship with the workplace, which then changes the dynamics of how productivity will play out for each of these different workers.
And I will say that I think that research is still pretty emerging in this sense, because we haven't all been working from home for that long, relatively speaking. So I think we're still just trying to find out how the dust is going to settle. But Brian, I think you're right. A lot of managers, a lot of leaders are worried about morale and about company culture and making sure that employees feel connected to their organizations, connected to the mission and the value of the organization. And so going back to what Shui was saying about enticements. So if you are a leader and you are trying to think about getting a workforce that is resistant to coming back to the 5 days a week, I mean, first of all, I think you need to think about, why do I want them back Monday through Friday in this session? But also think about ways you can entice them, ways to make them want to be in the office, to collaborate with their coworkers, to work on interesting projects, to be together in person in ways that we haven't been able to be for these past 15 months. So I think about it's using those kinds of carrots is what leaders need to be thinking about, rather than these sternly worded memos that we keep seeing so many CEOs come out with. I think that that's not going to work.
So Rebecca, you wrote a piece recently that said that for people who are able to work from home, there tends to be either the segmenter or the integrator. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about like what those terms mean, and which of those is, sort of the best model for avoiding people getting burned out from working at home, where, work always beckons.
So I think that you can get burnout no matter if you are an integrator or a segmenter, but it's sort of these two different camps. And work-life integrators are people who don't mind blurring the boundaries between their work and their home life. They can, for me, work on a story and then go quickly chop carrots for dinner, and then go back to my story and then go help my daughter with math homework. So it's sort of coming in and out of the workday and in and out of my personal life. And that's sort of what work-life integration is. For the segmenters, they're the people who really like to be maybe in a particular environment to do their work. They don't necessarily want to have any other interruptions from their personal life during the time that they feel that they want to be working and fully focused and fully concentrating and thinking fully about work. And it's sort of your personality. It's sort of which way do you operate best? Which way are you most productive, most satisfied with your life? And sometimes you don't even really have a choice. It's going to happen that way. We all certainly have not had a choice in the last during COVID. But these are just some of the considerations that if you are lucky enough to work for an employer who is letting you take part in these decisions, in the sense of how you're going to come back, where you're going to work, when you're going to work. These are just the questions you should be asking yourself about your comfort level in terms of blurring those boundaries between your work and your home life.
And this is also very, the way that you demonstrated a kind of distinction is very relevant for me personally as well. Because I feel like for me personally, I am a very extreme form of a segmenter. I have dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, which is where essentially for me, the context of the people I'm around determines so much of what my mind is able to think about and focus on. And so I've been relying so much on when I'm in the office, when my mind gets all trying to figure out what should I do? I look around, and the context around me is a bunch of people focusing on a particular type of problem, particular types of work. If I start chatting with somebody, they're in that mindset of this particular type of work. And that helps to really keep me in that realm of getting my work done. So the pandemic's been really hard for me personally, as now I've had to deal with because I've then kind of made it so that when I'm at home, my home space is where I deal with my own introspection, I deal with my relationships, I deal with a lot of these other aspects of my life, and I try to cut off really thinking about work. So now to have this space where I've been spending years training myself to cut off thinking about work so that I can focus on these other aspects of my life, be in a space where now I have to force myself back into work multiple times each day. I go out, get up, go have lunch, come back, and now I have to get myself back into a work mindset without any of that context. It's been such a difficult process because of how much I feel like my mind is just based off of this segmenting structure.
And you were saying recently you've been trying to go back into the office as much as they'll let you. Where does that stand? I mean, is Google planning on letting people kind of come and go as you want? Or what do you think is going to happen?
It's still being kind of worked out. We got a big announcement that basically said for each of the different types of arrangements, there will be some opportunities. Exactly how that's getting fleshed out is still kind of being figured out. So but we were told that some people will be working 2 to 3 days a week. Yeah, 3 days a week in the office with their team. Some people will be working at a separate office from the rest of their team. Some people will be working just completely remotely, and different directors of different departments are going to be kind of helping make that decision. So to an extent, our company had planned that September would be when the return time would happen. And so we're kind of in a period of them playing around and figuring it out up through that point.
I keep thinking, for months I've been thinking about what is this going to mean for cities. I mean, in the most broadest sense. Some readers sent in questions saying, what does it mean for commercial real estate, which is the real heart of the question. But from that, you can ask, what does it mean for our cities, right? I mean, if the model ends up being like, we only need people all together 1 week a month or 2 days a week, now all of a sudden that balance has shifted where, this expensive and beautiful office space that people were in 5 days a week, now they're in it less than half the time. And do companies still want to bear that cost? And then all the ramifications of that for local businesses that serve, the lunchtime crowd, all that. Is there going to be some kind of dramatic physical change in the working atmosphere? What would an office look like where people kind of only come in 1 week a month? Is that like a temporary space that a bunch of companies share? What might that be?
So I think one really funny kind of a comparison here is that in some ways this is now companies starting to ask the same questions about people that they've been asking about their machines. The cloud wave has really moved towards where we went from every company has to have specific space for their machines. They need to specifically own machines and area where they can then run the processing, to a space where now it's more you're paying for the processing rather than the full space of the machine, the full physical aspects of it. I see it in somewhat similar ways where then kind of the transition then is rather than having to constantly pay for all of the aspects of having a human being occupy a space, it's now companies are more making an exchange with the workers, particularly for the work that's getting done. And so then the question then is really, how do you properly measure kind of the difference between what are good checkpoints for different types of work, different workers? Do you need to have them check in twice a week to make sure that they stay on target? Do you need to have them check in once a month? What types of check-ins are actually useful for the employees to really make sure that it keeps things moving forward rather than just being micromanaging check-ins? And so I think there's a lot of different elements there where it's kind of like these pieces where you can then have it be where the way that you're thinking about just how do I work with the employee and make sure that the employee is moving forward is one piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle is when we do need to have employees come together and we need to have like, a big meeting where everyone's just in the same space for a while, or, we need to have some sort of event that is really good for just kind of building up the morale, building up the ways that people connect with each other, helping people to meet each other and get to know each other better. Then it's more thinking about, okay, for this specific need, how much time, how much space do we need for this? And so then it could be that essentially, like if you're doing something along the lines of each team needs to have the office space one day out of the week, you could then have it rotate through different teams where one department of your org, has all their check-ins on Monday. Another department of your org has all their check-ins on Tuesday. So then the Monday team, they all come in and fill up that space on Monday. And then on Tuesday, the Tuesday shift of that building. Whereas these workers are continuously working throughout this time, but the building is only really needed for each team one day out of the week. And then you are able to kind of use that same space now for 5 different teams essentially. And so like that way it kind of shifts it away from like, it moves it more towards a space where the way that you're dealing with a space is not so much about like, we're creating a little carve out that is for each individual worker, as this employee is, this is their workspace. But it's more that when we have these on-site events, how do we want workers to be able to kind of have their time and be able to spend time here versus going back to their natural workspace, which is back at home.
So, okay, when you were talking about the idea, and it's a perfect analogy, this idea that, machines, there used to be a server room in every company, right? And they offloaded the computing to the cloud. The computing, the data storage, whatever, became this like fungible resource. And it's interesting to think that now in a lot of organizations, they might think of their employees as sort of being in the cloud, which is to say accessible, usable, but not physically here, right? On the other hand, that's a trend that was going on in the industry for a very long time to not necessarily great effect for the workers. In other words, this idea of offshoring, breaking workforces up into these short-term contracts. So that was going on in a way that did not necessarily increase worker power. It brings us back to the question we were talking about at the outset about the union at Alphabet, a company where I believe more than half of the workers are in fact contractors, right?
Yeah.
So, we've talked about how, again, the desire for greater flexibility seems to have employees holding more of the cards, but maybe the long-term outcome is something else. So I'm just curious, back to what the impetus was for the union at Alphabet. I mean, what for employees who are going to find themselves in this kind of situation, what are the things to deal with, to look for, to think about,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think as you said, like this has been something that's been the case with employers for a while of, how do you think about your employees and how are you thinking through these different things? How replaceable do you see these different aspects? And so this shift towards remote does add to that flexibility of the potential replaceability. And so there is that concern as well, for sure, that this will then lead, as you said earlier, kind of towards more people becoming essentially gig workers, as that market's kind of been taking over as well. And so I think there then is this question of just like, how exactly do we make sure that people are being taken care of? But I think like it's also been part of this element where it's also super complex because of how much our society puts on the concept that your employment to, societally respected employer, respected enough that they are part of our social system, is how you eat. It's how you live. It's how you survive. And that
And how you pay for your medical bills.
and yeah, exactly. And how you pay for medical bills, how every aspect of just, your ability to still live on this earth is tied to being able to please one of the employers that has been legitimized by our system. And in that way, then it essentially makes it that when an employer decides, oh, for our calculating reasons, we don't feel the need to take care of you in the same ways, the dramatic impact it has on a person's life is really extreme, because that means now they have to figure out, how do I keep getting enough to eat, to keep living, rather than it just being, a calculation of, oh, okay, this project doesn't work for me, I don't fit here anymore, maybe I go find somewhere else. Most people aren't in a situation where it's just that type of a casual transition. So I think, like, across the board, there's a lot that we really need to do to make sure that as we go through all the transitions that we're going through, we're really paying attention to what happens when, your company is no longer interested in employing you full time, employing your role full time. How do we make sure that those people are still able to survive? And so I think, like, to an extent, that's been part of the impetus of the union as well. As we're seeing this shift happening, we want to make sure that we're able to proactively think ahead, think about what are the things that we can do to make sure that when people are going through these very difficult processes and these different difficult times, that the people are taken care of. Even as companies are making these complex, difficult business decisions, we want to make sure at the end the people are able to survive and are able to, get through each of these different complex moments without it destroying their lives.
Julie, what's the mood like at Google? What's the temperature check, in the sense of, does it feel that you're in an adversarial relationship with management? I think that's a question that's on my mind, and I don't want to make you spill the tea too much, but if there's...
Yeah. So at this point, it's not very much of a direct adversarial. To a large extent, it feels like the execs are trying to be as hands off and kind of ignore a lot of this momentum as they can, see if it's a fad that will fade, is kind of how I've been reading it. And so, like, to an extent, like, they've been trying to just avoid responding to any of the different things that we've said and done, which to us has meant, like, I mean, and, like, from what I've heard, it's like they've been essentially telling people to just treat us like we're one of the employee resource groups, which for us, like, is actually a nice space for us, where we want to just be a good space where workers can come together and think about these problems, and we can propose solutions. And we don't necessarily need to right now have it be where we're having every week, we sit down with execs and talk with them. Right now, our focus is on finding the people who most need help and figuring out what are the ways that we can collectively provide that. And so in some of these cases, we have helped groups to really put together a petition. And so some of those petitions have gone live, where we are really trying to push for certain needs to be respected and seen. But in a lot of cases, like, to us, like, it's been kind of a nice in-between space where they're neither coming after us nor really talking with us. And so we're just kind of left to see what can we get done when we pull our collective energies together.
What's an example of the kind of issue in which the union has spoken up, either for a full-time employee or for a contractor?
Yeah, so the biggest win that we've gotten so far, there was one contract worker who was working in one of our data centers, where we have the big machine farms, essentially, in South Carolina. And she was facing a situation where, they were stringing these contractor workers along. The vendor company we were working for was stringing them along with promises that they'll be given hazard pay. And that's why, things won't get as resolved as you would like them to with COVID, but we'll give you extra hazard pay. And then that hazard pay just wasn't coming. And at some point, she's frustrated about this, also frustrated about she has a water bottle that breaks and is told that they're not going to replace it, the vendor won't replace it for her, and that she is not allowed to ask any full-time employees for help with this, because she's just not supposed to talk about any issues that she has. So she complains about this on a Facebook post, and then gets told that she can't come back into work anymore, gets her privileges taken away. So she was just in the process of talking with the union at that time, was joining the union, and so talked with us about what was going on. And we very quickly got some lawyers involved who helped her to file an unfair labor practices charge, because she was being punished for speaking about the workplace conditions and the pay. And so that got her brought back on site, and a settlement where they then had to put up signs saying that the employees are allowed to talk about their workplace conditions and to talk about organizing. And so we were able to help get her job back. Additionally, another win that we got, there was a set of interns who they were basically told that because of the pandemic, there's no need for a housing stipend. You guys don't need housing. You're working from home. And they're like, we're students. We don't have a home workspace. And so like they were really trying to figure out what can we do? How do we get through this? And so started working with us. We helped them to put together their asks into a really good, well-formed letter that then got them the result. They ended up getting the housing stipends that they were looking for. And so then that's helping them through this summer right now.
Rebecca, a viewer question was sort of on the point that Chewy just raised. Is it common for the employers to pay for the home internet connection, computer, chair, desk, and so on for people now that they're working from home?
I mean, I think it's really company to company, organization to organization. I think you should definitely ask for that because you absolutely need those things to do your job. You should ask for at least a portion of your internet and phone to be paid for. But I think it really, I don't necessarily know if we will see any standards take shape if we are much more of a permanently remote workforce, which I also am skeptical that we will be a permanently remote workforce. So I think that that's really just organization to organization at this point. And if you're lucky, you work for one that is willing to chip in, and if you don't, you're kind of on your own.
I mean, and I think that's also then the question that employees at the companies can then try to figure out together. If a number of employees all really need this, it makes sense for it to be a business cost, you know? And so I think it's one of those things where this is also part of what needs to be kind of negotiated out of what are going to be the expectations. Are employees going to demand that these things that they got in the office are also taken care of, which in some ways like the complexity of how much it will cost changes in so many different ways. Like when you're no longer commuting, that changes a lot. When it could be, potentially you're sharing the cost of the internet with your personal use, that changes a lot. And so there's a lot of different ways that this could end up being a very beneficial shift. But at the same time, employers are going to want to cut down as much as they possibly can. So I think in every workplace, this is going to be somewhat of a negotiation unless we get some sort of a legislative shift around what are the expectations of what workers are given.
But I think Chewy has good advice there. And that is if you are working at a place and you're not in the midst of a union movement, finding other like-minded individuals who are saying, hey, I kind of need some money to get myself a good home office set up. Hey, I could use that too. Finding other people in the office to then go forward, or in your workplace, your virtual workplace now, to band together and go to management and say, these are things that we would like.
And I think a great example of that, a bunch of Apple employees just did that. Like they weren't doing it as a union, but in response to the return to office plan, a number of them got together and wrote up a letter saying, this is what we would like to see.
So we only have like another minute, unfortunately. We've been talking this whole time, about organizations where people can be remote. And I'm just curious to look at one recent instance of a workplace where people cannot be remote. Curious what each of you made of the failed union vote at the Amazon warehouse in Alabama. What did you think when you saw that?
So what it says? I feel like there's a lot of complexity to making a push for a specific bargaining unit. And I think one of the big elements here was that because this is just for that site and not for the entire company, this then meant that there's added fears of how's the company going to treat this site. And so like, when it's not coming out of a particular set of people who all moved into this region because they all want to be activists and organizers. It's people who are just trying to survive. The fear of what are going to be the long-term repercussions of being the initial site of a union launch, I think is a large part of what may have scared a lot of people from taking that step. I think there's a lot of people who can see ways that a union could help them, but also don't want to be the ones punished for being part of the first wave of it.
In coverage that I read, there are legitimate reasons for those fears, that those fears were instilled on the part of the organization too.
Well, listen, unfortunately, we are out of time. I have to turn it back over to Martin. But Chewy and Rebecca, thank you so much for taking time to, kind of speculate and, help people think through their questions. And, hopefully we can do this again in a few months.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
All right, Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Brian, Rebecca, and Chewy. The discussion was informative and a bit inspirational. I really appreciate your perspectives in discussing challenges like the complexity of a type of workforce tension triangle across flexibility, diversity, and productivity objectives, while also providing guidance to working professionals like workers need to take agency for their advancement, including self-awareness about being an integrator who thrives through switching between contexts, or being a segmenter who thrives where there are clear boundaries between contexts, as well as providing guidance to employers as well. Like a reminder that company leaders were intentional in shifting to virtual machines via cloud computing adoption. So now they should do the hard work to figure out how to entice and develop virtual working employees. In the opening, I mentioned our full-time MBA program will help you go further to go farther, or if you prefer to go farther to go further. So going further to go farther means engaging deeper in order to go a greater distance. If you want to dig deeper into a concentration like finance or marketing by adding a business analytics concentration, then you can. Going farther to go further means expanding across distance in order to develop your capabilities. If you want to earn a cross-discipline MBAX degree like MBAX Bioinformatics or MBAX Cybersecurity, then you can. To learn more about how we're preparing future leaders, check out our upcoming events at demore-mckim.northeastern.edu/events. Also, be on the lookout for more Boston Globe Future of Work events. Thanks for joining us today, and a fond farewell to you all. Take care.